Okay, friends, welcome back to the Studies and Counseling podcast. We're trying to have some of the most engaging, thought-provoking conversations in the field of counseling. And I'm here today with my new friend, Dr. Carveth. How are you today, Dr. Carveth?
I'm well. I'm well.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. Been really looking forward to this. I wanted to ask you this question we've been trying out with our guests, kind of a traditional first question, which is just kind of about your life recently. Just wondering what has been absorbing you recently, like what's been on your mind, whether it's professionally, personally, in the news, or just like what's on your heart and mind these days.
Two main categories of things, both, I guess, having to do with death.
Hmm.
My own, on the one hand, I'm a cancer survivor. I'm legally blind, and I have three stents in my heart because I have heart disease.
Hmm.
And I'm about to turn 80 in a few months. And the treatment for the cancer has been successful. The PSA test is undetectable now.
Hmm.
So I'm a survivor for the time being, but it'll come back, and it may have to be fought back again, whatever. But when you're about to turn 80, you start thinking, should I update my will? I don't get on an airplane without important papers being laid out so that if something should happen to me, my son, the executor, can find all of that. So I live with a sense of maybe I'll get to 90. That gives me 10 years. Maybe I won't get to 90. Very aware of the sand falling through the hourglass, right? The other big thing is the horrible Israel-Gaza war,
Yeah.
which uh, horrifies me, makes me feel pretty helpless. I feel like I can't really speak about it. I have uh, very close friends and family who are Jewish. Um, uh, on the other hand, what Israel is doing is, outrageous. So, you know, that's a real, that kind of haunts me. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah. Maybe thank you for sharing, Dr. Carveth. It's been absorbed by death recently, and both kind of the grappling with your own mortality through the sickness and the health scares that you've had,
Yeah.
and also through bearing witness to what's going on in the world right now in Gaza.
Right. Right.
Um, and one thing I recently read your book on dialectics and dialectical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and it's making me think like because yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about death because like when I watch your interview or your series, like they're filled with a lot of passion, I would say, a lot of life. I think
Right.
I feel like in love with the field of psychology again and psychoanalysis when I watch your lectures. So
Great.
for me, that characterizes you, but then now you're sharing this kind of other side, this life and
Well,
death.
well, I was about to say that despite the answer I gave, the thoughts about death, I'm not depressed,
Yeah.
and that is kind of dialectical. I'm still enthused about life. I'm a total blues fan, and we have after COVID, a really cool blues scene. Live music here in Toronto opened up, and my son, who's 33, soon to be 34, he's into it. We go out. I have to dance. If there's a
Wow.
space, I have to dance. I mean, look, if the right blues rhythm is being played by a good blues band, man, I can't. I gotta dance. So, but I usually wait until some of the women start dancing together, and then I get up, and they're all usually pretty enthusiastic that this old man is up there shaking his booty. So it's a joy. I mean,
Yeah.
when my favorite blues band is playing, uh, oh, and now they've just recently added a second guitarist who sometimes also plays a mandolin. together with the regular lead guitarist and the bass player, and they've got a hot new drummer, and the band leader plays a great harmonica. Um, I'm in joy. That brings me to joy. Those are just really joyous moments, you know. And I'm busy working. I'm writing. I'm at the writing another paper. I thought I was done with publishing when my eyes deteriorated to such a point that it's kind of difficult to write. But I find with the iPad and the online on-screen keyboard, I'm slow, but I'm able to produce stuff and get it out, you know. So um, yeah, both sides.
Yeah, it's hard not to get caught up in the myth of this blindness that you're working with, like something like Beethoven being deaf or Ray Charles being blind. Like there's something, it'd kind of be interesting to see how the quality of your writing might shift as you're engaging different senses.
Yeah, I'm using voice to text
Yeah.
a fair amount. I'm correcting that with my eyes because I still, it's great. The digital age, the accessibility. I tap three times and I magnify,
Hmm.
and I get everything read to me by my app. So any file I can read. There are all these workarounds, you know, and I guess that's what I've come to consider to be a central part of mental health, because life is going to throw this stuff at you, you know. Can you find a workaround? I mean, that's how you just keep going. You find the workarounds and you keep going until you stop going.
Mm. Yeah. Beautiful. And yeah, these images of you dancing in the blues, it's really exciting. Or it's like such an interesting image. Yeah, it's good for
Yeah, I
people
don't
now.
exactly look like the white. Yeah, I don't look like the type, do I? You know, silver fox and all, old guy, academic. I don't exactly
Scholar. Yeah,
scholar, but no, man, I really like to get down to good blues music.
that's fun. Yeah, it's really fun. What's the subject of your paper, if you don't mind me asking? Like, what are you working on?
Actually, the paper I'm working on right now is called "Underdogs and Overdogs: on the psychology of self-sabotage on the left."
Oh,
Example being Bernie Sanders, who chokes
yeah.
and withdraws and throws in the towel long before he should not have thrown in the towel. But you know, there are many historical examples of leftist leaders clutching defeat from the jaws of victory.
Hmm.
The right winger Mitch McConnell types, they don't have this inhibition. They go for the jugular. They're vicious.
Yeah,
And so I'm interested in the psychology that has hampered the left to such an extent.
that's interesting. Yeah, maybe can you help put that in the context? I'm very excited to read this paper because I've been studying the history of the psychoanalysis is also has had interest in the left, since like Wilhelm Reich, maybe
Yes.
before.
Yeah.
Maybe could you help put the your paper in context? I know you're a great historian of psychoanalysis, so how do you see your work in the context of psychoanalysis as applied to politics?
Well, I think Freud put his finger on the central importance of the superego, which over time he kept finding the superego as the central pathogen, even though in his sociological works he writes about it as kind of like a good cop that keeps us from falling into barbarism. In his actual clinical work, he sees the hostile, sadistic superego as the core of the pathology.
Hmm.
And he also wrote that paper. I think it's called Some Character Types Met With in the Course of Analytic Work, where he talks about people who fear success, people who are wrecked by success, the criminal from a sense of guilt. He goes and commits a crime in order to get caught and punished.
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about unconscious guilt, um, the unconscious need for punishment. Um, and so I think that leftist leaders, they are rebelling. They are rebels against the established order. But they have a piece of the establishment inside themselves called their superego.
Yes.
So on some level, the rebel feels guilty for being a rebel. And some leftist leaders are able to overcome that to a large extent. Um, some overcome it, they get into the fight, but at the last minute, they don't let themselves succeed. The superego gives them that inhibition. What you're doing is wrong. You're a bad boy. You know it. Okay, don't give the enemy the coup de grace. You're killing your father. You're killing your mother.
Mm.
You're a bad boy. Okay. Now you see this psychology all over the place. I'm a fairly self-revealing in this paper. I mean, I entered analysis in the first place because I had a writer's block. I was procrastinating finishing my PhD. The only reason I got it done was the university sent me a letter saying you have either 3 months or 6 months to deliver the PhD, or you lose all credit. If you ever want, you got to take all those courses and do the whole thing all over again. So they put a gun to my head. I went into my study and I produced the thing. But why was I procrastinating? Because
Mm.
I believed that getting my PhD was killing my father. There was only one Dr. Carveth in the Toronto phone book, and that was my dad.
Mm.
Suddenly, I'm going to be Dr. Carveth. I mean, he was disillusioned with medicine. He was a frustrated intellectual. I got my Freud and my Erich Fromm from my dad, from his bedside table where he was reading it. Is that going to be a problem?
No, it's good.
Should we pause and I call him and tell him to stop phoning?
It's completely up to you. We can pause. I feel pretty loose with it. It doesn't hurt our recording or anything.
Oh, it doesn't.
If
Okay.
it doesn't distract you, it's fine.
No, oh no, I'm just hitting.
Okay.
He'll finally realize, I think. Um, okay, so I was procrastinating because in my mind it was a crime. My father was proud as punch, took me out to celebrate, gave me a wonderful gift and a handwritten card. He was so proud when I got my PhD because he himself was a bit of a self-taught
Hmm.
intellectual, you know. Um, but I felt I just planted a dagger between his shoulder blades.
Mm.
Such was the Oedipal fantasy of Oedipal triumph and everything, right? Um, so people can provoke this guilt in leftist leaders,
Mm.
especially people who certain conservatives are really good at inducing this kind of guilt and inhibition. You know, they draw themselves up. It's as if they're confident God is on their side. They have a God given right to rule. And people who challenge them in their heart of hearts know they're just being naughty boys and they should grow up already.
Mm.
And that can stimulate in the rebel leader a terrible inhibition, which I myself have suffered from when I was in political fights, trying to lead my liberal colleagues to challenge certain conservative rules. But and I know I have the numbers in the room to win the vote, but I can't call the vote. We go on
Mm.
talking. Finally, we all go home. Next month, I put it back on the table. I'm allowing the talk. I'm not calling the vote. Finally, one of my conservative colleagues made a mistake. He accused me of playing politics when that's all he'd been doing for months. And that tipped me over. I had
Mm.
enough anger. I called the vote. We won. They walked ashen faced out of the room. Um, actually, I slept okay, but the idea that they might die in the room
Mm.
if I won the vote, or they might have strokes,
Mm.
that was certainly not conscious, but I think unconsciously that was the root of the inhibition.
Interesting. Yeah, it's
So I think
fascinating.
leftist leaders suffer from this.
Yeah, I think it will be really interesting to read this paper and put it in dialogue with some of the questions on the left about leadership. I think this is a massive tension on the left. Yeah, the right doesn't have to deal with it. Like, who's the man? Who's the strongest man? You know, pick
Right.
him. That it's very simple. And on the left, we kind of I'll say I
We're
more
supposed to be brothers. We're supposed to be
yeah,
fraternity,
yeah, yeah.
equality, fraternity.
When you think of leadership, like how does that, like how do we, you know, select leaders? I guess that's a question from a more liberal perspective.
Well, I mean, I think it's a problem. I think we have to kind of set our liberal perspective aside. I mean, the liberal perspective is about the goals that we want to pursue politically.
Yeah.
But we should become more like the conservatives when it comes to choosing leaders. We should choose, well, no, look, we want to choose a guy who is real, who has integrity, and who means it and is not a fake or a phony, you know. But we want to choose a leader who has managed to become an adult and he's able to be the man. That's a role he can play. And We choose a guy who is capable of being strong and hopefully not caving. We don't want a neurotic guy like me who's crippled by this fantasy, that the enemies are going to die of strokes or whatever if you defeat them. You want to get a guy who's healthy, who's got integrity, he's got the right values, but he's also able to pull the trigger. Most of the soldiers in the Second World War, or a great many of them, they never pulled the trigger. They couldn't pull the trigger.
Mm.
They never fired their guns. Now, I have very mixed feelings about that because I'm not very big on killing. I adhere to a Christian ethical outlook, but a mad dog has to be put down.
Mm.
Even Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a lifelong Christian pacifist, he realized Hitler had to be killed. He joined the assassination plot. Unfortunately, they missed, and Bonhoeffer was hung by the Gestapo. But I admire Bonhoeffer. He realized that certain mad, savage, evil types need to be killed. And so you want a leader who's capable of pulling the trigger, metaphorically. I mean, he's able to go for the jugular. He's able to strike when you need to strike.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting.
Otherwise, you're going to lose.
Right.
Why play unless you're serious?
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, asking if you want power or not. Like, I think a lot of this could be a good segue into some of the theory around dialectics. Is one of the people I like to look at, again, being an American, look at Martin Luther King Jr. And his writings are actually very interesting. And in American education, or at least, there's usually a critique from the more radical left that his kind of legacy is a bit whitewashed and people don't like really look into it. There's a fascinating letter he does looking at Nietzsche, actually. And he does an analysis of Nietzsche where he says that Christians need to have a better analysis of power and that love and power serve each other, and that many Christians aren't willing to take power and to, and I thought, yeah, that was pretty profound.
Right.
Writing. And I wonder if we could put some theory around this killing point, like the shooting point,
Yeah.
because you have some interesting. There's the dialectic book, but then you've also really brought forward, like in your Freud and Beyond courses, like some of Melanie Klein's work, like and like the paranoid and the depressive position, and how
Right.
it's actually not. You can look at those dialectically, like yeah, good and bad guy, like Nazis bad, liberals good is a it's a splitting, but in
Sure.
that case it's necessary, and that's why you don't.
Necessary splitting. Exactly. I have a
Yeah.
colleague who wrote a paper called In Defense of Splitting. He
Mhm.
couldn't get it published, of course, because psychoanalytic ideology right now is that splitting is bad. Well, there is maladaptive splitting, but there is also adaptive splitting. And if you can't split, you can't pull the trigger.
Right. Yeah.
And there are situations where if you can't pull the trigger, you're dead meat. I mean, the home invaders are coming into my house to kill me, rape my wife, whatever. Up in here in Canada, we don't have guns handy, which I'm
Yeah.
which I'm glad about.
Yeah.
I spend almost half my time in Pennsylvania.
Oh, really?
Uh, oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I'm in a distance marriage for 26 years, back and forth between Toronto and now it's Bryn Mawr. It was Philly, but it's
Hmm.
Bryn north of. But anyway, I know about guns
Yeah.
in Philadelphia. I'm glad I don't have one. Um, because there are certain circumstances where I would use it for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. And it, yeah, ups the stakes a lot. It makes that stage a bit more dangerous.
Definitely, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell the audience that's maybe not as familiar about the kind of theory we're talking about? So we've talked about like superego, dialectics. We've talked a little bit about Klein, but what are we talking about? Like, what is psychoanalysis for you, and what do you like to? How do you like to introduce people to it?
Well, I mean, I consider myself a Kleinian Freudian. Melanie Klein was a Freudian. She followed Freud and she extended him in the direction of where I think he was going, actually. Um, what's the essence of a psychoanalytic orientation? We believe in the unconscious mind.
Hmm.
We are all double conscious, at least minimally double conscious and unconscious. It's as if we have two different registers of thinking: secondary process, the rational thinking of everyday life, and then this primary process, which is the weird kind of thinking that goes on in dreams. It's a different language. We know something about how to work with the patient to decode the unconscious and make it conscious. That's one way of defining the goal of psychoanalysis, making the unconscious conscious. From my point of view, the psychoanalytic point of view, people are walking around. Um, Many people almost entirely unconscious of what the forces are within them that is driving them. I've been working with a kid who has gotten himself into a lot of trouble with the law,
Mm.
and through our work together, he is now able to understand how he's been motivated mainly by anger and rage, of which he was largely unconscious. But that anger was driving his antisocial behavior. And we understand now where the anger came from in his family life. And he has seen how that anger has made him both antisocial and kind of unconsciously suicidal.
Mm.
And he's got a handle on it now. And he's beginning to sublimate it. That is, he's beginning to find pro-social rather than antisocial outlets for the anger. And he's getting well. So that's broadly the orientation. Much unconsciously, we are often very self-destructive, and some people are destructive also very much of other people. Um, they're driven by childhood. They're driven by childhood pain and childhood rage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting to talk about. I think this is what you're talking about. I'm glad you put it in the helped us understand the orientation in the context of a case because it's making me think. I think like maybe some of the yeah, you could understand if we went back to the political example, like in your life, and really analyzed it. Like this idea of sublimation is interesting because it's not making you less politically active, right? It's actually kind of sublimating that whatever that inferiority is, or whatever the symptom that maybe orients us to the left. Like maybe sometimes I feel like a victim or I feel abused,
Mhm.
and that's why I want to lose to the right. Like that's why I want to be on the losing team because it's like repeating that abuse. And there's something about maybe standing up for other people who are abused and and like facing it that is driving me. So it's not necessarily that psychoanalysis for you is it's actually radicalizing in a certain sense through the sublimation.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
it is rather it's freeing me up to not be self-defeating.
Mm.
It's freeing me up to, well, I don't want to say the man, that's kind of sexist. It's freeing me up to be a competent adult who deals with the world in an adult, rational way and also a compassionate way. Yeah, I mean, overdogs and underdogs. I always rooted for the underdog. Canadian boy, naturally hockey fan. Toronto Maple Leafs. It wasn't hard to find an underdog. They were always going to lose, practically always. But I remained a Maple Leafs fan. What's that about? I mean, some people root for the overdog.
The
Um,
Yankees.
yeah,
Right.
I bet if you did a study, it would correspond with in the U.S. Democrat
That's
Republican.
interesting idea.
Yeah, I bet it would. I mean, I think Republicans definitely identify with the overdog. I always wanted the underdog team to win, and I would be overjoyed when they did.
Yeah. It's fun to see that. That's an interesting point. I did completely random question. So have you picked up a love of the Flyers or
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
another underdog.
my stepson-in-law, he's a Philly, every sports team, baseball, football, whatever, basketball. So sports, the big TV is always on in his house with one
The
game or
sports.
another, and he does some betting as well. So no, I'm pretty interested in Philadelphia sports teams. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. I guess another thing I like that you're looking at the left from a psychoanalytic perspective is I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the history seems to have been, at least the early history, is understanding like why the working class went to the right. The psychology of fascism, like in with Reich and the Frankfurt School and Marcuse, those kind of folks.
Right.
It's kind of
Right.
interesting. I mean, have you looked into that stuff? Have
Oh
you?
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
what do you
Yeah.
make of that?
I used to teach that, and I think they were all on the right track. My own thinking, well, especially Eric Fromm,
From, yes.
even though Adorno and Horkheimer and tried to write Fromm out of the history of the Frankfurt School, that was baloney. I mean, he was central, uh, and they tried to represent him as a kind of a popularizer, banal, which he was not. Very
Hmm.
sophisticated. And there's a Fromm revival going on right now. So, I mean, I look, the book that I found on my dad's bedside table that turned me on. There were two books, Freud's General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, but my dad was reading Erich Fromm's Beyond the Chains of Illusion, My Encounter with Marx and Freud. It was
Hmm.
a little book and a clearly written book, as most of Fromm's books are. I grabbed that book, Beyond the Chains of Illusion, My Encounter with Marx and Freud. Well, I swallowed both Marx and Freud big time. And I spent one summer, between third and fourth year university, I had been a drummer. I had a band. My father said I could, and I worked in the A&P warehouse unloading boxcars since high school. And he said I could have the summer off if I could pay my tuition at University of Toronto. I sold my drum kit. I They were going to be away. They said you can go to the cottage and spend your summer up at the cottage, but you got to paint the cottage. So I'd get up in the morning and I'd paint until around noon. And then I would go and chase girls all afternoon. And then in the evening, I sat down by myself and read Eric Fromm from beginning to end. That was one of the most productive summers of
Sounds like a
my
great
life.
summer.
I actually
Yeah.
got the cottage painted.
Yeah.
I had a lot of fun. I didn't impregnate anybody, and I learned a lot. So look, the Frankfurt School perspective, especially Fromm's integration of Marx and Freud, is centrally defining of my outlook.
Mm, interesting. Okay, so yeah, that kind of puts in context your book on the dialectic. Makes sense. So you're in. How would you describe where maybe you're, because obviously you have Hegel and then
Mm-hmm.
Marx and then you. Okay, I'll just put you in that lineage.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think you take up from Marx and Hegel, and what's kind of your critique of them?
What's my critique of them? Well,
It's a big
I,
question.
yeah, very big. My main critique of Hegel is his obscurity. Unfortunately, I think he's responsible for that turn in intellectual life, where nowadays, if someone writes clearly, the assumption is he must be dumb. In
Yeah,
order to gain the respect of graduate students, you have to be obscure. If you're not obscure, you're a nobody, which is
yeah,
what happened with Eric Fromm. He commits the crime of writing clearly. Well, I don't think it's a crime to write clearly, but I blame Hegel and Heidegger, and certainly then Lacan, for this cult of obscurantism, which is a form of sadism. It's sadism towards your reader. You know, Lacan is ridiculous with this. Um, okay, what's my critique of Marx? He's a vicious anti-Semite.
mm,
Recently, someone sent me one of Marx's essays, which is the most virulently anti-Semitic. Um, but that's aside. That's like ad hominem, right?
mhm.
I mean, Heidegger was a Nazi,
Sure.
but I still read Heidegger, and so Marx was anti-Semitic. All right, it's ugly, but I still read Marx. Um, well, what's enduring is his depiction of the nature of capitalism, the inherently exploitive nature of capitalism, the uh, impoverishment of the proletariat, the extraction of surplus value. I mean, I accept all of that.
Hmm.
You know, so he's an enduringly important thinker from my point of view. Um, he needs to have psychology injected into his framework, which is what Eric Fromm set out to do.
Right.
Freudo Marxism. This is
Yeah.
what is absolutely necessary, and I think it's been done. In a lot of interesting ways, but it hasn't. People have turned away from it, um, and people have gotten caught up in all kinds of, well, I mean, what people call the left these days, to me, is not the left at all. It's the pseudo left, which has abandoned the critique of capitalism for identity politics.
Right.
What the ruling class loves it. They
Sure.
love it because it prevents the left from uniting against their common exploiter. Um, so I'm old left. Uh, the identity politics is a huge distraction as far as I'm concerned.
Mm.
I'm amazed, I'm astonished that how many years ago, 10, 15 years ago, the Occupy movement, everyone was walking around knowing that the problem was the exploitation of the 99% by the 1%.
Hmm.
And that whole thing was a critique of capitalism, but it just evaporated.
Mm.
And within about a 10-year span, no one was talking about capitalism. People were talking about racism, sexism, heterosexism, all of that, which, of course, is important. I'm anti-racist. I'm anti-sexist. I'm anti-heterosexist. I'm woke. Okay, I've always been woke. You have a sociological training, you're going to be woke. You know,
Mhm.
but the woke got so busy celebrating themselves for being woke that they kind of forgot that there's another dimension that is important: anti-authoritarianism.
Mm,
Okay, you asked about a critique of Marx. Okay, Mikhail Bakunin,
sure.
Prince Peter Kropotkin. I followed them. I temporarily, for a year or two, worked with the Trotskyists, but I got rapidly turned off by their anti-democratic outlook. They were manipulative. They were caucusing before the U of T Committee to End the War, deciding how they were going to manipulate the wider movement. I accepted much of Bakunin's critique of Marxism, Leninism. The early Trotsky was a Menshevik. He was not a Bolshevik. He had a critique of Bolshevism. It was dead on. He said, first it'll be about the party, and then it'll be about the Central Committee, and then it'll be about the leader. That was his critique of Lenin. But then he dropped all that and he joined Lenin. So I always took I moved towards the anarchist critique of Marxism, Leninism. Chomsky is an anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist. Chomsky has had a huge effect on me. I discovered him in the 1960s. I've been reading him ever since. I pay close attention to what he has to say. I don't overly idealize him. He's not always right about things, and there are some problems. But anyway, that's the critique of Marxism, Leninism, which I want no part of because of its anti-dem. So I'm a democratic socialist or a
Hmm.
democratic communist. Free speech. Um, yeah,
I wonder
yeah.
if I wonder what you would think of this one text. It's pretty obscure. Have you heard of this book, Neither Vertical Nor Horizontal, by
No, I haven't.
Rodrigo Nunez? I think you'd like it.
Yeah.
It's he was looking at he's a Brazilian, I think a Brazilian, I apologize, somewhere in the global
Mm-hmm.
south. But
Uh-huh.
he's really he looked at Occupy a lot because Occupy was characterized, it's more anarchist,
It was.
spontaneous, bottom up,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and he was like comparing that with some of the party forms, kind of more traditional party forms in the early 20th century, and he characterizes those as vertical and top down, and then the spontaneous movements as horizontal. And he's kind of integrating these in this beautiful dialectical way. But I think it centers around what you're talking about, which is a crisis of leadership.
Right.
There's a problem of leadership, and then there's also a problem of organization. Really, is like there's something about emergence. Even capitalism takes this advantage of this. Is spontaneous order is a very
Mm-hmm.
powerful. Distributed cognition is very powerful. But how do you bend distributed cognition to humanistic values that
Right.
sometimes have to be a bit more top down because the masses can have, we can be more driven by drives, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like very fascinating text. It reminds me of your work a lot, but coming
Well,
from a completely different field.
maybe if you could put the title and the author's name in an email to me, I would appreciate it. It
Yeah, yeah,
sounds
I'll
like
send it to you.
it sounds like something I should definitely read. Occupy was really troubled by that bottom up anarchist, which I admire the goal, but it really rendered them pretty ineffective in the long run. So I see that as a problem with the whole idea of anarchism. Um, we do need leadership. We need a we need a strong leader
Yeah,
who, nevertheless, is a leader who respects the basic principles and the boundaries. We need a strong leader whose behavior is constrained by things like constitutions, constitutional monarchy, right? I'm kind of happy with Canada. I mean, we didn't throw the Brits out. We just kind of gently let the years go by until they went into retirement over there in England. And
yeah,
then we brought our constitution home, and we have a guy who represents them in our government, Governor General, who represents the Queen, now the King, of course, but has no real power. It's merely a symbolic figure. So we took a long time to grow up. You guys did it so abruptly that in certain ways you have remained adolescents, hence the guns.
Hmm.
We don't have guns up here, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. Guns, and there's something about like the like the narcissism too of like entrepreneurship. Like it's almost like I can be president. Everyone, there's definitely class society in America, definitely, but it's much
For
more
sure.
unconscious than with my European friends. Don't
Right.
see it as clearly. And there's
Yes.
an idea of, and there is a beautiful part of it is there is a chance at upward mobility. That is a myth and that can unlock a lot of positive things, but
Mhm.
also negative too,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
narcissistic in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we're a little more aware of the class nature of society up here, because this country, it doesn't make any sense, this country, because like our maritime provinces would naturally go with your maritime provinces. Central Canada would naturally go with the prairies, and British Columbia would go with Seattle, and so on. That's the way trade flows. But the only reason we're a country is because we had a government that was sufficiently socialist that the government built a railroad from sea to
Mm,
sea, and that's what kept made this country possible. And then, of course, Tommy Douglas brought us socialized medicine and a party called the New Democratic Party, which is used to be a socialist party. Now it's like a vaguely left liberal
mm,
kind of party now. But Canadians have always been much more comfortable with government as a bringer of necessary good things than Americans are, I think.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Have you looked at it? You seem like a kind of astute follower of American politics. Do you kind of have an analysis of that? Like, what is the fear for you from a psychological perspective for Americans? Like the healthcare issue seems so intractable. Um, yeah, our left
Well,
is
it's
yeah.
grounded in this fear of, well, I mean, it's very hard to generalize. I was going to say it's kind of like you never got quite over your anger at the king,
Mm,
the Boston Tea Party, and then the revolution. Uh, on the other hand, Republicans certainly don't seem to have much trouble uh, playing king. I mean, a guy like the Republican Senate leader, he has very little inhibition. He can play politics and play it dirty, and doesn't have any trouble being vicious. Um, so I don't know. I don't know. It's a complicated question. America's attitude toward authority,
yeah.
complicated subject.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to look at. Like even the Republicans, like one thing that's interesting that characterizes them oftentimes, like Trump will fall, like they will, like he'll be a rhino at some point. All of the heroes seem to turn, and I think it's just starting with him because he's kind of pro-vaccine, and so that's all tenuous. His movements tenuous on that level.
Right.
Um, yeah, I think, and he is kind of popular on the basis of draining the swamp, right? Like destroying the authority, less so than a kind of positive program of leadership. He's more of a destructive figure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, I think people like McConnell, it's amazing. Interesting thing about American politics, I think it does come down to like Citizens United and the money thing is like people can have immense positions of power with like no popular support. like without a base. Like I think it'd be hard to go in the streets and find someone in America who's like, I'm a Mitch McConnell fan. He has voters, but I don't think people are like, I love Mitch McConnell in the sense that they like Bernie or they like Trump. People actually are attached to them in some way. A lot of
Right,
these like Pelosi and McConnell, they don't really have a constituency outside of the fact that they have enough machinery to win the primary.
right.
Uh, yeah, it's just kind of an interesting thing. There's not a lot of popular support behind candidates, I find. Um, yeah, and the ones that do are usually characterized destruct. Their Bernie is against the 1%, like it's the enmity thing, as
Uh-huh.
opposed to like a cult of personality. So yeah, I'll have to think more about this American connection to authority.
Right.
Yeah, but yeah, we'll be really looking. Maybe we could trace backwards a little bit, Dr. Carveth. So you're writing the text on the overdogs and the underdogs, and
Hmm.
then was your last big book, was that the Dialectics book, or what kind of
No,
happened?
that's in this last spring, in
Oh,
2023, Guilt, A Contemporary Introduction. Small
yeah.
book.
Hmm.
Thank God they set a limit, 40,000 words max, which was perfect for me with my vision problem. I could crank that out. So and it forced me to write very concisely. I'm pretty happy with that book. I mean, the other two books reflected the fact that I spent 46 years in the university and write kind of like an academic. The sentences are too long. The a little bit turgid. But this one, I really focused on the point, and I tried to write as clearly and concisely and as directly as I possibly could.
Mm.
I think it comes to about 80, no, it comes to about 70 pages long, the book. And I'm pretty happy with it, I must say. All about guilt, the unconscious need for punishment, self
Hmm.
sabotage, and the distinction between conscience and superego, which is, I very much identify. I'm not at all the only person to push that. Eric Fromm in 1947 distinguished humanistic uh, superego from an authoritarian one. 1958, Carl Jung wrote an essay called A Psychological View of Conscience. He
Hmm.
clearly distinguished conscience from superego. Superego is a socially derived, socially internalized values. Conscience for Jung is archetypal, meaning grounded in nature,
Mm.
not in society. And I have gone Neville Symington, originally a Brit, but worked in Australia. He understood this distinction too, partly because he was a former Catholic priest who
Mm.
became an analyst. The distinction between conscience and superego is grounded in the New Testament,
Mm.
in the distinction between law,
Mm. Yes.
Moses, and gospel, Christ. So uh, I've been very much pushing that distinction so that we can understand conflicts between conscience and superego, which we've not been able to really talk about because we didn't have the concept, because Freud folded conscience into superego in 1923. We have to reverse that. That's the central point of my work.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad you brought up and I'm excited to read that. I haven't picked that one up. I just finished the Dialectics book, but
Okay.
yeah, okay. But I am familiar with a lot of your work on, and I think this is one of your big theoretical contributions to the field, right? Is kind of, yeah, fleshing out that genealogy you're just talking about and kind of formalizing this.
Exactly.
And so could you parse that for our audience a little bit? Obviously, y'all get the book, which we'll
Sure.
link, but
Well,
conscious super
a
ego.
super ego is that inner authority. I follow Freud.
Mhm.
Superego is id aggression turned back against the self. The kid can't unload his anger at the parents. They'll withdraw or they'll punish him more. So what's he going to do with his anger? He's going to turn it on himself. You can see kids banging their heads against the wall. You can see kids starting to hurt themselves.
Mm,
That's the essence of superego, id, aggression turned back against the self. That's the core. Then a second layer is the internalization of societal values via the parents' superego. From parents, from teachers, from peers, from media, you internalize. And so, its core is aggression turned on self, but then it's also socially internalized values, quite distinct from conscience. Conscience has a biological basis.
mm,
Many studies over the last 30 or 40 years, animal research, especially research on primates, has shown that they are far more social, far more altruistic with members of the same species. Um, Paul Bloom's work at Yale on 3-month-old children shows that they already have a conscience. They always choose the helpful bunny and reject the harmful bunny, at least until they vary the experiment. Sometimes they bring out the good bunny with no cookie, but they bring out the bad bunny with a cookie. And the kid is corruptible over time, especially when it's 2 cookies, 3 cookies. But basically, little kids prefer helpers over herders. Um,
mm.
so Thomas Selly and others have done research in psychology supporting this whole idea of a biological grounding. Well, of course, Bowlby believed that our attachment needs are innate and unlearned, as with other primates. And so the need for attachment and the conscience are pretty close to the same thing. And Winnicott gave us the concept of the true self, which he
Mm.
defined as the child's going on being. I mean, it's kind of Buddhist in the sense that any self will not be the true self, because the true self is not representational. It's on the level of being, not on the level of knowing. So I can be my true self, but I can never really know my true self. But I believe that conscience is grounded in the true self. It's grounded in our biologically given going on being. But of course, parents are inevitably going to be intrusive and abandoning, and we're going to have to shift from being to developing defenses, a false self, a mask. And some people get lost in this process of false self development. Some people become extremely alienated from the true self and alienated from their conscience. Um, what is the goal of psychoanalysis, of psychotherapy in general, counseling? Helping people reconnect with their true self, helping
Mm.
them reconnect with their conscience. And that is the path I don't want to use health because I don't like the medical model and the medical metaphor, but let's call it maybe maturity.
Okay.
The path is liberating conscience. And the more you align your life with conscience, the more the hostile, sadistic superego cannot get at you. You see, like when you align yourself with conscience, you find the courage to stand up to bullies. And that's exactly what the superego is. It's an inner bully. And if you're right with your conscience, you don't take that anymore.
Yeah.
You back it down, you know?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, there's so many implications from this. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about, yeah, the superego is more kind of socially taught. It's like taught, and the conscious is something we're kind of recovering,
Yeah.
um, or learning, maybe developing. That's a
I think we
innate.
develop it. I
Yeah,
think the bedrock of it is there, biologically given, but absolutely it becomes developed as the child matures and as his thinking matures.
I'm wondering if you could reflect back on, because it's great. You're like I've made a lot of theoretical contributions, but I think, you've kept a private practice and you're still practicing. And I think
More
that's
bit busier and busier now than I ever was in my life. Because when I was at university, I was a full-time tenured academic. I
right.
could only have a small practice on the side. But when I retired 10 years ago, I expanded it and it
I'm,
got real busy during COVID.
and it seems like, I don't know, it seems I've only known you since then. I haven't read your academic work as much, but it
Well,
seems,
you've been reading the book about dialectics.
yeah.
Those chapters were all written and published while I was an academic.
Oh, gotcha, gotcha. I'm
Yeah.
curious the relationship between your clinical work and your theoretical work, like how they inform each other. That's a question I really want to ask.
Well, I love teaching. I was uh, I was a popular teacher, sort of charismatic, I guess, and I always would go to the pub with the students after class, and we would talk about everything. And the kids wanted to talk about their private troubles with me. And I had to draw a line because I was not a therapist. I was a mere academic, you know? So I did a lot of referring people to therapists. But I finally I decided, look, I'm not content to be just an academic. I want to work on these deep personal levels with people. That means training as a therapist. So I trained
Mm,
as an analyst, and that liberated me to do that because I wanted to get into it on a deep existential psychodynamic level. And I found it very, very gratifying. You can only go so far with intellect. And then you begin to realize that the intellect is like a cork floating on the water. And meanwhile, the tidal movements are pushing the cork every which way. You know, the cork may think that he's running the show, but that's a delusion. I mean,
mm.
the intellect is so influenced by unconscious emotional forces that you have to get into the emotions to get anywhere with a human being. So that's what I did. It was the right decision. I find clinical work really absorbing and fulfilling. I'm able to work now in the digital age by telephone or WhatsApp. I don't like the screens because I can't see the screen anyway.
Yeah.
And analysts never saw their patients. The patient, and I have some people back in the office. I am seeing people in person again. And when they come in, they walk to the couch. They see me for a few seconds, then they lie down. I'm sitting to the one side and behind them, and I'm not seeing them, and they're not seeing me. It's called a talking cure. We're listeners, and that works very well over the phone or WhatsApp. The screen, I'm not interested in the screen for multiple reasons. But this makes it possible for me to treat people in Tehran, in Saudi Arabia, in Australia, in the US, in Portugal. I have patients all around the world now that I'm
Wow.
able to treat with these earbuds in and the iPhone.
Mm.
And some I'm seeing once a week, some I'm seeing 3 times a week. Um, so I'm feeling very fortunate to be able to practice this way now. Hope I can continue for another decade.
Yeah, me too. I have to too. That's really interesting, like that form of analysis, the couch, and then it's really about listening.
Yeah,
Because there's so much information. It's hard to visual is just so dominant, you know.
yeah.
And it's like I feel
I don't want to be seeing these beautiful young women who come and lie down on my couch. I don't want to see them. Well, I'm blind anyway. I can't see them. And I'm
yeah,
too old to do anything about it anyway. I'm too old to get myself into any trouble. But no, I mean, I'm kidding. The
yeah.
cutting the visual out of the picture means removing a whole layer of distraction and so then I follow Wilfred Bion to a
Mhm.
considerable extent, and he talks about the importance of the analyst's reverie. Well, so did Freud. Freud said freely hovering attention on the part of the analyst and free association on the part of the patient. Bion is saying the same thing. He's talking about the importance of the analyst's reverie. You don't want to be in a focus state. You want to be in a relaxed, receptive, style of listening so that you can begin to hear the unconscious. Um, yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think that kind of therapist, psychotherapist presence, maybe that's a little lost in some of the teaching on psychoanalysis, like that clinical side.
Totally. We veered away from it just at the same in the same way we veered away from guilt. Prior to 1960, Freudian Kleinian analysts were not guilt evading, and they were listening with the third ear to the unconscious. Okay, but by 1960, Sandler in England was saying analysts at the Hampstead are no longer sorting their clinical material in terms of guilt and superego.
Hmm.
20 years later, 1982, Jacob Arlo in New York is saying the same thing. No one is presenting case material having to do with the superego anymore. Um, then you have the emergence of self psychology and relational psychoanalysis, and this is a real veer away from the unconscious. Everything is becoming social. Everything. So within psychoanalysis, there has been a deterioration and a regression. Now, I'm not a conservative, so
Yeah.
I I was into these new. I was passionate about self psychology. I was totally into relational psychoanalysis. I got into all of these trends. And I had a critique of Freud, Freud's patriarchalism, Freud's sexism, Freud's classism, and so on. I was a critic of Freud, you know? But, and some people will just say, well, that's because you got old. All old men revert to a more conservative, but I have definitely come back. To me, the important gold of psychoanalysis is in that early Freudian Kleinian work. Before they started following neoliberal culture of narcissism into an attack on the regulators. You know, the right wingers want to get rid of all regulation. Psychoanalysts were following suit. They were getting rid of the psychic regulators, conscience and superego. So just as I'm hostile to neoliberal deregulation, so I'm hostile to that kind of psychoanalysis.
That's a
Um,
really interesting. I haven't heard it put like that before. I think that resonates. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Psychoanalysis is a part of the culture. When the
Yeah.
culture goes for deregulation, and the culture of narcissism, the last thing a narcissist wants to face is his guilt. So the culture of narcissism is in flight from superego regulation. It's in flight from guilt. And psychoanalysis followed suit. Stop talking about superego, conscience. Stop talking about guilt. I'm trying to bring us back. In that sense, I'm very conservative about psychoanalysis. I want to get back to the gold.
Well, and maybe dialectic too.
Yes, the relational piece. You're right. You're
Yeah.
right. Of course, the relational people made contributions. Heinz Kohut does sit back here over my shoulder, and absolutely, yeah,
But I mean, I think that you are like, even in just our conversation, like I've noticed we've talked on some themes, like we've talked about war, we've talked about like sex, we've talked about dancing, the blues. There's this kind of like more, dare I say, like masculine penetrating energy.
yeah,
That I would say, I mean, I'm one of, in my graduating class, two males. You know, I would say that there's, there's, and I have in my practice, like empathy and holding a kind of maternal is important. Um,
absolutely.
However, sometimes it's like we need to have some encouragement, like, like some, hey, let's shake things up a little here, like that's important. I'm not saying I'm not like
No,
a,
you cannot sit on my lap.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yes, you have to pay for missed sessions.
right.
No, we can't go for a walk in the park and carry on the psychoanalytic session. So listen, my struggle as a young analyst and my supervisors really helped me. My dad had surgical training, physician, and becoming an analyst in a way was me rejoining my dad in a certain sense. I ended up having patients. He had an office on St. Clair Avenue. I had patients in my office a block or so south of St. Clair. So I'm rejoining my dad in a physicianly role, right? But in the early days, I thought as he might make an intervention with a scalpel, I was going to make verbal interpretations. I was going to be penetrating people.
Yeah.
How masculine, my supervisors kept saying, Don, don't just do something, sit there. One guy started developing an obstetrical metaphor. I'm kind of like an obstetrician, but that didn't help much because obstetricians use forceps.
Mm.
What really helped when we got to the midwife metaphor. Well, see, that's a
Oh.
gender switch. I'm becoming a wife, a midwife. You mean I got to change gender orientation? So I was way too active, way too penetrating. I had to learn how to become more feminine, receptive. Not that receptive is feminine, whatever. That those gender associations are patriarchal. You don't have to gender them that way. But I did have to move from penetrative active to much more passive receptive, although receptivity isn't always passive. There's a kind of active
Mm.
receptivity,
Yeah.
but I had to switch in that direction. Now when I became a supervisor, I found that many women had the opposite problem. They were all holding and containing and empathizing and the point is the therapist sometimes needs to enforce boundaries, needs to stir the pot. You don't hear people saying this. Analysts have to learn how to become agent provocateur, you know, to liven up the therapy, to actively confront things that the patient doesn't want to confront.
Mm.
So the women had to move in the direction of becoming much more active, and the men had to learn how to become more receptive. It's
Mm.
dialectical. Both are needed. We need a daddy and a mommy.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. It's fascinating. Um, Also, I wanted to ask you too about, have you seen, did you see the True Detectives, the first season with Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson?
Yes, I did.
Do you remember that quote? Woody Harrelson is having his affair and he's kind of rationalizing it, and it's like halfway through, and Matthew McConaughey's quote is, "People who lack the capacity to feel guilt do have a better time," or something like that, or sure know how to have a good time. Talking
People
about,
who lack the capacity or
yeah,
have the capacity.
lack the capacity,
Oh,
because
have a better time. Uh-huh.
he's sitting there like eating delicious food and drinking a beer while
Uh,
on the job, and he's having an affair with this like young 20 something woman,
well,
and
I mean, he's completely wrong.
yeah.
He's completely wrong. I know this personally. You see, I did not want to be a good guy. I was raised in the Episcopal Church, but I lost it at age 12 when I discovered girls and masturbation. So I wanted to have fun. I wanted to have every girl that I found attractive. I didn't want to have to be faithful. I was a player.
Hmm.
Okay. I'm in my third marriage.
Mhm.
Um, uh, I went straight. I have never been unfaithful to my wife for the 27 years that we're together. I adore her. She cured me, and all my analysis cured me. But life was busy curing me um, because I discovered that there's only one reason to go straight, as we used to say. I was big hippie in the 60s. My hair was down to my ass. And my son's hair is in dreads down to his ankles.
Well,
Yeah. Anyway, the only reason to go straight is because not going straight doesn't work. You keep trying to have your cake and eat it too, and wine, women, and song, and you just get yourself into more and more trouble and more pain. So I went straight, not because of a moral revelation that I wanted to be a good man. I reluctantly recognized I have to be a good man because the other path is too painful in the long run. Yeah, okay, you may have some fun here and there, and you drink and you eat and you have sex, but in the
yeah.
long run, that breaks down big time. It's the path of pain. That is
Mm.
so naive what he said, but it's a what he said is so typical of the culture of narcissism.
That's why I brought it up. I think it's something that's very profound, actually, because you mentioned profound in the sense of how we're swimming in it. Or I feel I was born in 91, so I think I am just swimming in this culture of narcissism.
Yeah.
And so this is, I'm referencing, oh, what's the, Lash, Christopher Lash.
Christopher Lash,
Yeah,
1979, Culture of
yeah,
Narcissism. Great book.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's what kind of woke me up to this idea. But it's not surprising to me. I hadn't heard of this historical context, but guilt actually, like, because I think there is a neurotic guilt, and there's a question,
Sure.
there's healthy guilt and neurotic guilt, but I think pretty much in me and my peers,
The
we
healthy
almost,
guilt come the healthy guilt comes from conscience.
yeah,
The neurotic guilt comes from superego.
yeah. And, but I think that without this, in a culture of narcissism, like conscious is almost seen as authoritarian or something,
Yes.
or, yeah. And I think that's really problematic. I mean,
Well,
uh,
that's why the distinction is so important.
yeah,
Look, in counseling and psychotherapy, it's a real problem because we're all taught that we must not be moralistic or super egoish with our patients. Okay, but they don't have a concept of conscience. We can't be super. We should not be super egoish, but we need to be conscientious. Our patients count on us to have a conscience. Even the psychopaths want us to have a conscience.
mm,
Okay, they certainly don't want us moralizing, but they want us to have a conscience. And we have to be very careful about how we deploy conscience. But they know that when they're telling me that once again they're starting to cheat on their wife, I suddenly kind of go pretty quiet. They know what that means. I don't like what I'm hearing.
mm,
Or if suddenly he's back on cocaine, or he's getting drunk all the time,
mm,
or he's starting to do those sleazy business practices again. I don't reproach, but I do go quiet.
yeah,
You know, and I think I work the other way too. When the patient is making progress in becoming more conscientious, I praise him.
good job. Yeah.
So he knows basically. And the thing about this, we fell so victim to postmodernism. I mean, Chomsky won that debate back in the 50s with Foucault. I mean, what, we're not animals? I mean, Chomsky, of course we're animals. We have a particular kind of brain that makes language functional for us. I mean, but anyway, we got so heavily into sociological relativism with the postmodernists, but it's all nonsense because there are universal values. There's a core of universal values that all people in their heart of hearts know are right. Life is better than death.
Hmm.
Love is better than hate. Truth is better than lies. Kindness is better than cruelty. We all know this. You postmodern and relativists, they talk as if there's a great mystery about values. There is no mystery about values. These core values are like universal. I say in every playground in the world, in every culture, you'll hear kids saying, "That's not fair. You had your turn, now it's mine." No one set them down and taught them the norm of reciprocity. Kids
Yeah.
just know that.
I think it's not that, for me at least, I think the conflict, like, especially, so I'd be curious what you think of this. Like, my analysis of like the post-structuralist, postmodernist is that, the Russia is just such a disappointment. Like the turn to authoritarianism is such a tragedy, that it's like no structure, like all structure necessarily evolves into authoritarianism, and there's this kind of desire to anger, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
at destroying these structures, to the extent that it's even being turned on, like just from a very basic comparative religious, like we have some core of universal values. I mean, that seems unproblematic, but even that is seen
Mm-hmm.
as problematic,
Yeah.
and like in some ways supremacist or something like that. There's this like turn towards it, but I think like actually there could be this interesting, I think about like who mediate. Like I'm a Quaker, so I like the Quakers, and we
Okay.
sit and we just like there's no preacher.
There's no liturgy.
Yeah,
There's no sermon. No, I understand. I know a little bit about it. Yeah.
yeah. So it's very the values are unmediated, and this is considered like taboo because it's like you're just a human being. You're not supposed to. You need mediation. You need a priest. You need someone like mediating these values for you.
Hmm.
That's the problem. I think it just goes back to the thing of leadership and like narcissism. Is like how do we trust who's telling me these values or like what is right? That's like this core paradox is that we're both human and animal
Yeah.
and we have access to values. And so I think that's hard. That conflict is just hard to hold, that ambiguity. And there's a lot of trauma around like trusting people who I thought I embodied these values and they were like a child sexual predator. And it's like, good God, like,
Absolutely.
can I trust anyone?
Why
Um,
should you trust your therapist, your
yeah,
counselor? You don't know the
exactly.
guy or the woman from Adam. They could well be a serial killer for all you know.
Yeah.
The whole opening phase of counseling and therapy is the patient testing and watching and trying to decide whether you're a decent human being and can you be trusted. We want to establish an atmosphere of safety and trust in the therapy. That's the huge task. We work long term analysts with patients. I
Yeah.
would say almost the first year is devoted to building what we call a working alliance, building an atmosphere of safety and trust. No, we have to be skeptical. We have to keep our eye on our heroes. It's not the same thing as hoping to get the dirt on them to destroy them. Like much of the
Yeah.
media is all about that, right? First, the media builds them up and then tries to tear them
Destroy
down.
them. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. But we gotta, I mean, is the preacher buggering the boys in the back room or not? It's happened so often in so many places. You have to suspect this a little bit.
So I'm curious. So on that note, like I mean, it seems one of the core questions here, what in analysis and politics, all the topics, how have you gone about distinguishing conscious and superego voices? And
Oh,
but yeah,
well, because the superego always speaks in an authoritarian, moralistic, harsh, critical, scolding, whipping. It fundamentally wants to whip you, and it sounds that way. Um, I once said that my model of the superego comes from the Bergman film Fanny and Alexander. The father has died, the
yes,
mother remarries, and
excellent.
it's the guy she marries is beating the children, right? He loves. He's a Lutheran bishop. He
Yeah.
loves to beat the children. I'm saying I wish Bergman had done a close up revealing that he's got an erection.
Mm.
He's getting off on beating the children. The superego loves to beat you. It pretends to be concerned about morality. It's not really concerned about morality. It wants to catch you in some immoral act so that then it can do what it wants, which is beat the hell out of you. That's the superego. Okay, the voice of conscience is quite different. Conscience has a bite. Conscience is unhappy with you when you are off the path, but mainly it wants to call you back to the path. And the perfect metaphor for this is the biblical account of the prodigal son. The other boys stayed home and with the father and worked the farm, and the younger guy, he took his inheritance. He went to Babylon or Egypt. He blew it on whores and gambling, and then he's broke and he comes crawling home. The father is delighted. Kill the fatted calf. Your brother is home. We're having a party. I mean, you can see the older brothers being a little resentful of this. They stayed home all those years and worked. But the point is, that's a story about forgiveness, and it's a parent who loves you and is willing to forgive you your sins and your crimes. It welcomes you home. Okay, conscience calls you to come home and welcomes you when you do. That's a very different voice.
Mm. Yeah. The quality of the voice and the quality of the message. So there's some level of accountability and conscious, but it's not punishing and whipping.
Exactly.
Yeah. What a
Exactly.
what a powerful like way to think about politics too. Like I can't imagine I think there's a lot of superego at play in politics, like leftist organizations and like canceling and like
But
guard
Take Bernie though. I think you could hear the voice of conscience in Bernie.
definitely.
Bernie he was trying to practice the politics of love and the politics of conscience. Unfortunately, he didn't have the backbone or whatever to fight.
Hmm. Well, and I think it's going on a lot in America right now. It's like it's the if you fight too hard, Trump's going to be your fault, like like
Mm-hmm.
you're they and I think that stifles conscience a lot. Like I won't vote for someone. We were talking about Israel Palestine. Like I don't want to vote for someone who's actively supporting a genocide. If you believe that,
Oh, I agree entirely.
yeah. And but then it's like, well, do you want Donald Trump? Do you hate women? Are you anti-immigrant? And is your conscious like? And that's like where the superego comes in, and it's like whipping and punishing. And it's like, no, like this is a
Yeah.
something I'm going to stand for.
Well, that's what I when I was so angry at Bernie when he bowed out. But I tried to contain my anger because I always listen carefully to what Donald Trump to what Noam Chomsky has to say. And what Chomsky was saying at the time was Donald Trump is the leader of a death cult. I think Chomsky had been reading Eric Fromm on necrophilia, the love of and the necrophilic character, who often is the leader of a death cult. Anyway, that's what Chomsky said. Trump is the leader of a death cult. He is so dangerous that we have to accept the philosophy of the lesser evil. Biden is the lesser evil, so we have to support Biden. That's what Chomsky was saying. At the time, I had my doubts whether Biden was such a lesser evil, and but I tried to listen to that. But the way things have unfolded, I'm not at all sure that Biden was a lesser evil. You look at what he's doing now or not doing now. What would Trump's stance be toward Israel Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine a worse stance than what's going on now. And
Exactly.
yeah, um, well, yeah,
I question this philosophy of the lesser evil.
I do as
I
well.
think you have to question it. Yep.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah, take a stand. Yeah, be willing to. Yeah, I think it's tough. Like, actually, it might be kind of similar to this. Like, I think that maybe there's sometimes like a reckoning. Like, I'm curious if you have any clinical examples of someone breaking out of a long period of narcissistic acting out, and then like there's almost this reckoning of yeah, like if we're going to rebuild something, there's probably going to be a painful period of yeah, like difficult. There would be a power vacuum and like some kind of breaking free. It probably won't go perfectly, but it's almost like we're, that's just a materialist reality. We have, um,
Well, if we take the analogy with work with individuals who suffer from pathological narcissism, and this guy, he's bullied his way and knifed his way up the corporate hierarchy, and he's been vicious in business, and he's been engaging in shady business practices, and he's been chronically cheating on his wife, and uh, doing a lot of cocaine. And that's who this guy has been. And he's gotten wealthy in the process. And finally, he comes for analysis, usually because he's being forced to by his wife, who says, I'm going to leave you if you don't, kind of thing. But whatever, he's usually coming to analysis being pushed by someone rather than okay, but maybe the analysis, maybe he actually starts to like and begins to sort of trust the analyst. And uh, I have a lot to say about certain kinds of techniques of working with people like that I have found helpful, because I was a bad boy myself. I know how to talk to bad boys.
Hmm.
I can fake being a bad boy. I'm not a bad boy anymore, but I can still sound like it and act like it. It's got something to do with the dancing and the blues clubs. There's somehow
Yeah.
a connection there. But so say the guy actually gets engaged in the analysis, and say the analysis actually starts to work. Well, my God, at certain points in the process, he is hit hard by terrible guilt. A lot of that guilt coming from the superego. And now me, his analyst, is switching, to trying to help him defend against the superego attack, while at the same time trying to help him listen to the emergence of a
Conscious.
conscience,
Wow.
Yeah. You slip and you say conscious. That's always a problem. Conscious or conscience. People drop the
Conscience.
N.
Yeah.
Conscience. Got it. So, but anyway, so then he's hit by guilt. He's hit by self-recrimination. He's getting depressed.
Yeah.
He's getting depressed. I have to somehow help him survive the depression. I mean, if he moves into the reparative position, he could become easily suicidal, and sometimes unconsciously suicidal. I mean, accidents start happening, and he gets
Mm.
hurt. He's hurting himself. He's then there's shame. He's ashamed of how he has lived. Um, it's like trying to kick an addiction. He's addicted to that way of living, and now he's trying to do without the supply. Um, and a lot of it, whether he survives this trial, will depend a lot on the kind of. Hopefully, he's got a good wife who really loves him. She might actually be a key to him surviving and getting through this process. Who knows? Maybe she saw a core of goodness in him that got lost for so many years, but she sticks with him maybe. And boy, what an ally of the analyst she becomes, right? Um, Chances are that won't happen. Chances are he's in a rotten marriage. Chances are he'll have to ditch that marriage as part of his cure. I'm not ever telling a patient that. I don't tell people what to do, but it may evolve that he may have to ditch that marriage. It may be a part of the problem, or it could be a part of the solution, depending on the marriage. But yeah, he's going to have a hard time changing.
Yeah. How do you conceptualize these cases? I'm very fascinated. It's ringing true for me. So it's someone who's dealing with a lot of narcissism.
Yeah,
Is that a narcissism? And the conscience is waking up, but then the
is waking
superego
up.
is attacking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so is it
And
like an
his underlying pathological narcissism is really grounded in the opposite. It's grounded in very negative self-esteem. It's a huge defense against feeling like a nothing, or feeling like someone who's bad or evil at the core, or useless, or whatever, a nothing. So he builds up this grandiose self, as expressed by Matthew McConaughey.
yeah.
That. So he's built it up. That's a shell, and when that shell starts coming apart, you're facing terrible feelings of worthlessness and shame, and one can easily become suicidally depressed when the mask falls.
Yeah. I have had a bit more exposure to the Jungian side of psychoanalysis and depth psychology, and they talk about sometimes like shame and glory being the opposite poles of a similar archetype, like hero and loser, you know?
Yeah, same deal. The
Yeah.
Jungians and Freudians are not so far apart. It's just a different language, you know. I just
Yeah.
think that the Freudians spend the whole period of the analysis pretty much working in what the Jungians call the shadow, you know.
Yeah.
The old style Jungians, I used to think that they held their nose and made a mad dash through the shadow to get to the old wise man and the divine child and blah blah blah.
That's true. That
But
resonates.
yeah, I started out with the Jungians for a year or so, and then I realized that I was so effed up that I needed to spend years in the shadow work. So I chose to go to a Freudian, and I'm glad I did. But modern Jungians are very different than they were 50 years ago. They're like well-trained psychoanalysts in all the schools of thought. They don't just do that old style
Yeah,
Jungian stuff anymore.
absolutely. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's a good point. But that's a funny image. Definitely the popular kind of YouTube pop Jungianism, that metaphor of running through the shadow with the nose is definitely still holds. That makes sense to me.
Right.
And yeah, Freud doesn't let us do it. It's sex and at mom and dad and shit, you know, it's like,
Siblings, killing
yeah,
the siblings.
yeah, it's really good for that. Wait, I did want to ask you something else. What was it going to be? Coming up for me. Um, yeah. Dr. Carveth, I wonder if this was like a dream or something, but there was a video I watched from you years ago that reminds me of this conversation. I could not find it before, but I want to say, and I apologize if I'm wrong on this, but I thought it was with your wife.
Ah, Gene Hammond, yes.
And she's also an analyst.
An analyst as well, trained in a very different school of thought, modern
Okay.
analysis, Spotnitz school, but yeah.
I saw this video of you two talking about borderline, and there's this very provocative idea, and it reminded me when you were saying, I know how to work with bad boys, but I think you said, or she said, you with borderlines, it's sometimes clinically helpful to play a psychopath.
Yeah, that's why we took it down. It was too
Oh,
controversial, man.
I'm
That's
sorry to
why.
bring it up. I'm sorry
No,
to bring
no,
it
no,
up here.
no, no, no. It's okay. I'm
Oh,
happy talking about it. I'm
okay.
happy talking about it. No, she was saying, and I respect her. She knows how to work with borderlines much more than I do. I mostly try to not work with borderlines. I pride myself on getting them, if they get into my office at all, I pride myself on getting them out of the office as quickly as possible. A year ago, a woman came, and I suspected even on the phone, but she stayed in my room here for like 20 minutes.
Hmm.
And then I managed to get rid of her. She was severely borderline.
Yeah.
And I don't have time for that. You know, but my wife loves, you know, my wife's attitude is bring it on, baby. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
because she's saying the one thing that trumps borderline is psychopath. Um, Borderlines are failed psychopaths,
Right. Yeah.
failed psychopaths. They can't really pull it off. So they're
Hmm.
all over the map. But she knows how to play hardball, as does Marsha Linehan, DBT, right? Because Linehan calls herself borderline. And she knows the territory and she knows how to play hardball. You know, she enforces the boundaries of the frame. Until the frame is secure, there isn't going to be any real therapy. It's just going to be a constant demand to adhere to the frame. And if you don't, you're not going to get anything, you know? She plays hardball.
Hmm.
And so does my wife. And my wife, I think, has some pretty good success with borderlines. I leave that to her. I refer the borderlines to other therapists. I want to work with people who already are defining themselves as patients. You see, borderlines don't want to be patients. They just want to rattle the cage for
Yeah.
years. You know, I, if someone comes to me and they know they've got a problem and they want to work on it, I'm their guy.
Hmm.
You know, but I gotta have that willingness to see that I'm in the grip. He sees he's in the grip of irrational forces. He sees that he can't figure it out on his own with his rational mind. He sees that he needs my help, and he's willing to do the work. Okay, let's go.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah. I have to say that that insight from years ago. I work in addiction a lot.
Okay.
And one thing that I found, and this will be, I'll segue into a question I have for you on like diagnosis and how psychoanalysis approaches it. But like thing I think is problematic with the DSM in America is that like addiction is always the same, like it's substance use disorder in the DSM-5. And there are so many different character formations and structures that show up in addiction.
Right.
And I won't say favorite, but one of the most interesting ones I find is people who are working with borderline and like severe addictions. And it gets worse. Like as they start making progress with like the addiction was actually a smart move for them.
Hmm.
It was like a compromise. It's like, well, alcoholism isn't good, but it's better than cutting tires or something or
Right.
stabbing myself or killing someone. So it's actually pretty rational for the
Right.
psyche to be
To
compromising with drugs. It's killing themselves more slowly, which, you know, it's not good, but it's better than.
works as a defense against something worse.
And then like literally they go into treatment, and this lack of understanding, I feel like it's fatal because their defense is ripped from them
Yep.
by force, and then they kind of relapse into a severe kind of borderline situation, and then
Right.
have this intense guilt for relapsing on drugs when it's actually smart because it's saving them. And it's
Right.
just this huge mess that we have to untangle. And actually, your wife's insight like really helped me start conceptualizing things better and kind of
Right.
I think I had impulses to be a bit, I was calling it manipulative,
Yep.
but it was actually therapeutic to work with them in that kind of call out, challenge the manipulation tactics they were doing to me, and
Oh,
also
well,
think
good.
once,
Good for you. Good for you
yeah,
for figuring this all out.
yeah.
Well, you disappeared or something. What
Oh,
happened?
you see?
I don't see you.
Oh, I've got you.
Oh, you know what it is? It's my iPad saying it's low battery.
Okay. Well, maybe that's a good sign for us to do a final question because we're
Sure.
coming up to that point
Maybe I
anyway.
can get rid of this and get the picture back again.
Yeah.
Let me
Try.
see what I can do here. Um, okay.
Is that
There
better?
we're back. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. So I have this final question I like to ask. Well, first of all, you've been very generous with your time. I'm so excited to watch this back and take a bunch of notes because we've covered a lot of interesting ground. And I like to ask a final question. How can the audience help you? Like, how can we find your work if we are interested in learning more? Like, what are some actions we can take to get involved with what you're doing?
Well, that's a simple one. Just go to my YouTube channel. I started in 2015. I think there are about 120 video lectures up there. That's a whole school of psychoanalysis there. I've got six lectures on Melanie Klein, following the textbook of Hannah Siegel, Introduction to the Work of Melanie Klein. I've got a series of four lectures on Wilfred Bion's work. So there's a lot there on almost every topic you might want to inquire into. And then there are the three books. Uh, Probably best to start with the third, the most recent book. It's the shortest and the clearest of anything I've written. So that would be the prescription.
Nice. Yeah, and I know there's a large but secret contingent of counselors in the audience that are secretly obsessed with psychoanalysis and just looking for an excuse to really dig into it. So
Okay.
maybe we'll form a little reading group or something based on your work. So I'm putting out that call for the audience. Message us and we'll get involved in that. Dr. Carveth, I'll give you the last word. Do you have anything final you want to say?
Just that I've enjoyed this interview. You're obviously a very thoughtful guy. You have a good understanding of all of these issues. So I appreciate being interviewed by a guy who has done his homework and knows what he's doing. And so I wish you all the best with the podcast and just with your practice in general and your life.
Yeah, that's important too. We won't forget that. So thank
Yeah.
you. Yeah, that's really encouraging. And I want to thank everyone for listening and get the books and follow the YouTube channel. Okay, bye everyone.